Greetings, everyone. This is Professor John Gillespie of San Jacinto College. This is my presentation of New Worlds for All, which explores the social and political and economic situation of Europeans, Asians, and Africans before the Columbus discovery of the New World in 1492. So let's get going. I encourage you to pause the presentation at this point and write down some of the key terms and questions that you will need in order to proceed in this presentation. They will be important for you on exams and future classroom activities. Well, folks, the period between the collapse of the Roman Empire in about 476 CE and the Renaissance, which you can date to maybe 1450 or so, is known as the Middle Ages. In Europe, that means that there's no dominant political system, no king or centralized authority that controls everybody. In fact, Europe is known as a system of competing states because the city-states known as England or France or Germany have yet to solidify and make themselves known as a political identity on the map. This leaves Europe open to invasion by various forces, and they are invaded several times by folks like the Vikings, and the Mongols, and the Arabs and the Magyars. And Europe is also pretty poor as far as education or literacy and very terrible hygiene, not a very nice place to live. Very few people in Europe have even traveled 10 miles from their place of birth, showing you how limited their world is and how limited their sort of intellectual horizons are. There is one source of unity for Europeans during this time, and that is the Roman Catholic Church. When we say this, we need to distinguish it from the various Protestant churches that begin to appear after about 1517. Right now in Europe, the only source of sort of spiritual unity right now is the Roman Catholic Church. It was the only institution to survive the fall of Rome in 476 CE. And as Europe regrew and built upon the ruins of the Roman Empire, the church grew in power and authority. So what does the church do for Europeans? Well, because they are a system of competing states, they do not often identify with each other. They certainly don't have any collective identity as Europeans. But Christianity does broker a common identity, and it endows Europeans with a common system of morality to which they can all refer. One historian puts it this way. She says, beginning under the Roman Empire, intellectual leadership in the West has been provided by Christianity. In the Middle Ages, who invented the first universities? In Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, it was the church. So the Catholic Church is arguably the most powerful institution of the Middle Ages. It was led by the Pope, who is seen as the vicar of Christ. That means the substitute of Christ on earth. The church also held more than just spiritual power. It held temporal power, meaning secular power. Secular power, such as the rule of kings or of other people in authority, rests on the blessing of the church. So you do not have temporal power or power over secular institutions unless the church is going to give you its blessing, so to speak. One of the challenges that comes about in 622 is the rise of Islam. This begins in the Arabian Peninsula when a prophet named Muhammad says he received a revelation from Allah, which is simply the Arabic word for God. He recorded his message in the Quran, which is somewhat analogous to the Bible for Christians or the Old Testament or the Pentateuch for Jews. It's Muslim holy scripture. It affirms monotheism, that is the belief in one God, but it denies the divinity of Jesus. So it is set apart from Christianity in this very important way. And Islam is going to spread out of the Arabian Peninsula by both conversion and conquest between 632 and about 750. And it's going to keep going after 750, but this is the period that you're looking at right now. It spreads into North Africa and the Levant by 661, in the Maghreb and Spain by 711, and Christian Europe is becoming alarmed at the advance of Islam. And so this map can demonstrate for you just how quickly Islam spread after the first revelations of Muhammad in the Arabian Peninsula and how it moved over into what we would today call the Middle East, of course, North Africa. And then if you have a look, it's beginning to make inroads into Spain. So Charles Martel, the king of the France, managed to defeat the Muslims at the famous Battle of Tours in 732. This did slow the Muslim advance into Europe, but did not entirely stop it. And for many people on the European continent, this vindicated the Christian faith, sort of solidifying its veracity. But much of the Iberian Peninsula, which we would call Spain or Portugal, remained under Muslim control. And you can see my little green map down here. The Muslim invasion from North Africa consumed much of the Iberian Peninsula. So Muslim Spain became a center for a lot of learning and commerce at this time. But Muslim control is going to last, at least in part, until the Battle of Grenada in 1492, and we'll need to stand by for more information on that. And so we have to understand the importance of the Holy Land to not just Jews and Christians, but also to Muslims. This is the land of the Bible. This is the site of Solomon's temple, which no longer stands. This is where Jesus conducted much of his earthly ministry. And this is also the place of Jesus's execution, that is the holy city of Jerusalem. This is also the place where Muslims teach that Muhammad was taken into heaven and received instruction about prayer. Well, in 1095, European Christians decided that they were going to retake the holy city, that is Jerusalem, from the Muslims, and that they're going to go further and also attempt to conquer the entire region. This series of forays, these military incursions into the Holy Land, are collectively known as the Crusades. These were taken on by knights or European soldiers who were motivated by religious zeal, but also the chance to go off and get some wealth and some land and score some temporal victories out there in the Holy Land. The Pope even promised forgiveness of sins for somebody who is willing to take up the cross, travel to the Holy Land, and do battle with Muslims and even Jews along the way and attempt to take back, so to speak, the Holy Land for Christendom. The Crusades were a very bloody business. Jerusalem was retaken, so to speak, in 1099, but it was amid such horrible slaughter that one French crusader recalled, on the top of Solomon's temple to which they had climbed in fleeing, many were shot to death with arrows and cast down headlong from the roof. Within this temple, about 10,000 were beheaded. If you had been there, your feet would have been stained up to the ankles with the blood of the slain. What more shall I tell? Not one of them was allowed to live. They did not spare women and children. Well, all of this in Jerusalem returns to Muslim control in 1187. And it wasn't just Jerusalem. The Crusades ultimately failed. The Christians did not take back the Holy Land, so to speak, for themselves and kick out all of the Muslims and all of the Jews. But it did have some lasting consequences. One of them is increased resentment toward the Jews that the Europeans encountered along the way and developed some pretty bad relations. Another one was, of course, increased tensions between the Christian West and the Muslim East, because nobody likes to have their homeland invaded and trying to be taken away. But for our story, probably the most significant of these consequences was the introduction of Westerners to Eastern stuff, good stuff, things like silk and porcelain and spices and more. And Westerners really begin to gain a taste for these things. And so, as a consequence, a lively trade in Eastern goods grew, which enriched European markets. So, the goods typically flow along the ancient series, this network of travel passages called the Silk Road or the Silk Roads. And you can see they connect Asia with what we would today call the Middle East. So trade was really slow. It's really costly. It's often unprofitable. You've got to carry things by camel, which means you're really limited to how much you can carry. It also means that there are people that are wanting to take payment or charge you sort of like a toll booth along the way. And then the major port of entry from Asia into Europe is the city of Constantinople. It's not the only route, but it is the main conduit. One of these major port cities through which goods travel was Constantinople. So Constantinople was the major port city through which goods flowed through the Silk Road to Europeans. And so it was a heart-stopping event then when in 1453 Constantinople fell to the Muslim Turks and was renamed Istanbul, which it is today. And so now the most important trade city, most important to European merchants, was now in Muslim hands. And of course, there's a lot of bad blood between the Muslims and the Christians of the West. And so goods are going to become much more costly. They're going to become much more difficult to obtain. And so the question is raised, how are we going to get to the East? How are we going to get the stuff, the goods, the silk, the spices, the porcelain, those things which we had become so accustomed to enjoying? Well, the tiny little state kingdom of Portugal is going to give us the answer. So there is Portugal. You can see it on the edge of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain being right next door. Before we get to Portugal, let's take a look at an Italian traveler named Marco Polo, a fellow who claims to have visited the East. He's from Venice, and he says he set out in 1271, made it all the way to China by 1295, and he speaks of great wealth in incredible cities and makes these fantastic claims. His book, Travels, inspired many Europeans to go and seek out the riches of the East, one of whom was this fellow named Christopher Columbus, which we're going to meet in a minute. So here's a map of Marco Polo's supposed travels, where you can see he started off in Venice and traveled all around to what would be modern day China or Vietnam through the Indian Ocean. And just to give you an idea of how important his writings were, here's an excerpt when he talks about his visit to the Great Khan. He says, "You know that it is the greatest palace that ever was. The roof is very lofty, and the walls of the palace are all covered with gold and silver. They are also adorned with representations of dragons sculpted in gilt, beasts and birds, knights and idols, and sundry other subjects. And on the ceiling, too, you see nothing but gold and silver and painting. On each of the four sides, there is a great marble staircase leading to the top of the marble wall and forming the approach to the palace. The hall of the palace is so large that it could easily dine 6,000 people, and it is a great marvel to see how many rooms there are besides. The building is altogether so vast, so rich, so beautiful, that no man on earth could design anything superior to it. The outside of the roof is also all colored with vermilion and yellow and green and blue and other hues which are fixed to a varnish so fine and exquisite that they shine like crystal and lend a resplendent luster to the palace as seen for great way round. This roof was made, too, with such strength and solidarity that it is fit to last forever." So from this excerpt, we can see Marco Polo is really trying to sell Europeans on the idea that there's a lot of great wealth to be had in the East, and a lot of people believe him. I personally don't think Marco Polo went anywhere. I think this is a sort of a travel book designed to get people excited and well to sell stuff. I even I can't prove it, but I wonder if a guy named Marco Polo ever even existed. Well, Marco Polo aside, let's turn back to Portugal, and we can see that Portugal had long sought to overcome the geographic challenge posed by the Ottoman Empire. Even before the fall of Constantinople, the Portuguese monarch, Prince Henry the Navigator, had established a school of navigation in 1420 to train Portuguese sailors on the latest techniques on sailing and navigation and reading the stars and things like that. By 1434, Portuguese explorers had reached the Cape of Bojador on the West African coast and established contact with the West African societies there. By 1488, Portuguese explorers had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in today what we would call South Africa. Now, in 1492, we see the fall of Grenada and Spain, and that's not immediately linked to Portuguese exploration, but I do want to point out something that's going to have great significance to one of Portugal's rivals, which is the Kingdom of Spain. Well, by 1497, the Portuguese had established trade in India. And so the big takeaway here is that the Portuguese have become masters of the Indian Ocean trade, and they dominate the commerce in that region. Well, as Portugal is exploring the west coast of Africa and establishing contacts there, their neighbor, Spain, is looking to unite and solidify their power. And they do so in 1469 when Ferdinand and Isabel, two separate Spanish monarchs of two separate territories, unite those territories through marriage. They're known as the Catholic monarchs because of their fidelity to the Catholic Church and to that institution and its propositions. So when they get married, they do more than just form a new family. They combine their financial and military resources and are able to resume and finish the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain from the Muslims. And that means they expel all of the Muslims from Spain, kick them out of the country, and of course, take their stuff and enrich the Spanish coffers. They also ordered all unconverted Jews to leave the country, saying that this is a Catholic country, this is going to be a country for the Pope, and we're not putting up with other faiths. Well, Spain is now wealthy, they are politically stable, and also very confident in their own mission and place in the world. And so, right here in 1492, with the Reconquista completed, Spain's coffers very rich, in walks this guy. So this guy's name is Christopher Columbus. He's a middle-class guy from Genoa, which is in the Italian peninsula. He's a well-traveled guy. He's an excellent navigator, a seaman, a trader. He has a lot of experience. He very likely saw the Indian Ocean trade and has been to Lisbon, which is in Portugal. So he knows his way around ships and he knows his way around navigation. He also has a really strong faith in God and a sense in his own divine mission. So his pitch before Ferdinand and Isabella is to get to the east by going west. Now, yes, this means around the world. And contrary to sometimes popular lore, or maybe what some folks have heard in elementary school, everybody really knew that the world was round. Educated people had demonstrated that the world had been round since the ancient Greeks. So he had tried to sell this idea to Portugal, to England, and to France, and the answer was always no. People thinking this is just too much of a wild proposition. Well, Spain kind of says, why not? And that's how Spain looked at it. They didn't think, oh, thank God, here's this guy, this answer to our prayers. He's going to sail to the west and get the stuff from the east. They're thinking, well, we've got a little bit of extra cash. Why don't we throw it this guy's way? If we never see him again, hey, we're only out a few ships and a little bit of money, so what's the big deal? So Columbus gets 3 ships and a little bit of startup cash. And as you can tell, this really isn't a huge venture. This isn't an armada setting out there. Ferdinand and Isabella aren't really expecting to see a whole lot. They're just trying to see what's going to come out of it. So the 3 ships, as we know, are the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And he sets sail for China, or maybe it's India, or maybe it's Japan. He doesn't really know. He just thinks that he's going to set off for the west, and somehow he's going to bump into the east. Well, he really gravely miscalculates the distance. And I know a lot of people like to beat up on Columbus for this, but I don't think anybody could have properly or accurately calculated the distance with the information that was at hand. He estimated it was about 1,200 miles. The reality is it's about 3,000 miles. He was basing his ideas on Ptolemy's world map, which, as I said, was some of the best information that an educated person could have. So as you can see here, Ptolemy's world map is not really all that accurate. You can see Africa is really not the shape that Africa would be. India is way off. You've got Sri Lanka down there, which is uh, far exaggerated, and Europe is more or less accurate. But Ptolemy's understanding of the world was simply not complete, and so we cannot really expect Christopher Columbus to fill in the gaps on his own. Realistically, this is about all we can say of what Europeans knew of the world in 1492. They knew Europe, they knew part of North Africa and the coast of Western Africa and some of Asia. But as far as the rest of the world, certainly North and South America, we don't know about these things. Far East Asia, we don't know about these things. Australia is just a rumor. Well, Columbus does make landfall on October 12th of 1492. The most likely spot is San Salvador in the Bahamas. Now, the significance of this landfall can simply not be understated, okay? It linked the Eurasian landmass with the Americas that separates ecologies and peoples that had not known one another for at least 17,000 years. Um, it inaugurates the European age of exploration, in which we're going to see millions venture across the oceans for various reasons, whether it be for money making purposes, political freedom, or religious freedom. Many people are going to follow in the stead of Columbus and these first discoverers. And of course, we cannot forget to mention the many people who came unwillingly, namely the African slaves. But you're asking, wait a minute, wasn't Columbus, he wasn't the first one to find the Americas, right? There were certainly others. And you are absolutely correct. Columbus was probably not the first European to set foot on what is known today to be the Americas. Strong evidence suggests that others came before him, but did not stay. One of these contenders is St. Brendan the Navigator, who was an Irish monk living in about 461 CE, 5th century CE. And he set out on a voyage of evangelism. What he intended to do was spread the Christian faith. That was his job as a Christian monk. And so he tells of these travels of going across the Atlantic in a leather bound boat and to where he journeyed for many, many, many months until he bumped into paradise. And some people have wanted to look at paradise and compare it well to Nova Scotia or to the northern parts of Canada or something like that. Well, maybe, maybe not. He also tells us that he saw dragons and sea monsters, and he celebrated mass on the back of a whale's back. So, a little bit fanciful there. So, Saint Brendan the Navigator's accounts as history, it falls a little bit short. We are on firmer ground, so to speak, when we talk about the Norse, whose voyage to the Americas was probably somewhere around 1000 CE. There, the chief explorer was a guy named Leif Erikson. You can see his picture off to the right there. And the Norse sagas tell of settlements across the oceans to a place that they call Vinland. And the descriptions, a little bit like St. Brendan's, are very similar to that of the landscape of Nova Scotia or Newfoundland today. In the 1960s, we got it. Archaeological evidence of Norse settlements were discovered in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, demonstrating once and for all that the Norse were very likely the ones that first discovered America, at least the first Europeans to discover America. Well, nevertheless, Columbus never admitted it, but he founded a new continent, the Americas. And of course, this falls into the realm of geopolitical politics. Who gets what? Whose territory is this? Of course, we're not going to be considering at this time in our history the opinions of the Native Americans or the Taino Indians or anything like that. This is going to be a discussion about Europeans that takes place among Europeans. The Portuguese had claims to the Indian Ocean. And so the question is, where is Columbus anyway, and what kind of stake, what kind of claim can he make on this territory that he has landed? Well, the Pope, who is, as we mentioned earlier, going to be somebody that we look to arbitrate secular as well as spiritual disputes, the Pope, Alexander IV, draws a demarcation line in the ocean right there in 1493, arbitrarily dividing the world into two separate spheres of influence, so to speak. So on one side, the eastern side of the demarcation line, everything's going to go to Portugal. That's Portugal's domain. They can settle, they can trade, they can exploit the people, whatever it takes, right? And then to the west, to the land that Spain is starting to move in on, that will be Spain's territory. So that's the demarcation line of 1493. And Portugal, because as you can see, Portugal's domain falls right there in what is today Brazil. And Portugal claims all of Brazil in 1494, and that's going to stick. So let's take a look at what's happening internationally. What's going on in the larger world? Well, we look at landfall in 1492. That was Columbus, right? October 12th, 1492, which set off this age of exploration. The next big claim is going to be Portugal's claim on Brazil in 1494. Now we look to the north and we start to see some stirrings of England, in which they employ an Italian named John Cabot, who lands in North America in 1494 but does not establish a permanent settlement. Portugal is continuing to make its presence known in the Indian Ocean, and they claim exclusive trade with Calcutta in India in 1502. They move on to Malacca in 1511. Not to be outdone, the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez lands in Mexico in 1519. What becomes Mexico? It's right now the land of the Aztecs. That's the largest empire there. And a few years later, in 1533, Pizarro defeats another empire called the Inca in Peru. And Francisco Coronado, moves northward and claims the American Southwest by 1540. Then we have Martin Frobisher, again sailing for the English, who sights land in Canada in 1567. But the English are still going to fall short of establishing a permanent settlement right here. So that's sort of a bird's eye view of the geopolitical situation and who is starting to claim what in this European age of exploration. And so you're probably wondering, what are we doing with these colonies? Well, they're being used as sources of wealth. And they're going to be either mining, or they're going to be looking for gold. They're going to be doing various agricultural enterprises. But all of this is to increase the wealth and the power and the status of the mother country. So the Portuguese are going to purchase the first enslaved Africans for work on the Madeira Islands, and the Madeira Islands just off the coast of the Iberian Peninsula. They're going to be using enslaved Africans in sugar plantations, which is a very, very difficult, labor intensive economic activity. And what people begin to notice is that slavery has always existed. Slavery has always been a part of every human society, but this seems to be particularly harsh. It seems to be particularly bloodthirsty. The mortality rate is really high. You see people dying faster than they can be replaced, and so the question is raised, although somewhat not very loudly right now, is this form of slavery even moral? Again, we call upon the Catholic Church to answer this question, and Pope Nicholas V issues an encyclical Dum Diversas in 1452. He says, "We grant you, kings of Spain and Portugal, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and reduce their persons to perpetual servitude." So there you have it. The moral question is solved. Can we enslave people? Yes, we can, says the church. And there's a couple things to notice in this document. One, there's a condition for who you can enslave. Europeans may enslave non-Christians. The church is not too keen on enslaving other Christians. But only folks such as a Muslim would be fair game, or an African that follows a traditional form of religion would qualify according to this document. And of course, the Native Americans of Central and South America in the new colonies are certainly going to fall into this too. And then, of course, the other thing we want to recognize is that the Pope says that this form of servitude is going to be perpetual, meaning it's never going to end. We can hold these people in slavery as long as we want to. So this document, a turning point, not exactly the turning point that we'd perhaps like to see in the recognition of human rights, but nevertheless, we have to recognize what the church and what European Christendom is saying about other people and how we regard them. Christopher Columbus is very much a man of his age. When he assessed the Taino people, or the native peoples of the Caribbean, he looked at their stuff and he looked at their willingness to resist. And he tried to see to what extent we can use these people as new forms of labor. So this is directly from Christopher Columbus's journal. He's writing back to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. He remarks, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things they exchanged for the glass beads and hawks' bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms, and do not know them. For I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance." So from this document, we can infer that Christopher Columbus is, of course, thinking about them from a commercial standpoint. He's thinking about them from a materialist standpoint. Look at the things that they have, glass beads, hawks' bells. And then he says they willingly traded everything they owned. And of course, if you're looking at financing Christopher Columbus's next voyage in Spain or back in Europe, you're going to want to know these things. You're also going to want to know, is this venture going to be successful? Are these people going to mount any resistance to you? And Columbus again assures us they do not bear arms and do not know them. I showed him a sword and they cut themselves. So he's really trying to sell his next voyage back home and get some more money. Another one of the quotes out of his journal is even more alarming to us from the 21st century. He says, "They, that is the natives, have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." And of course, that is what Christopher Columbus did. Shortly after arriving in the New World, he enslaved the natives and forced them to look for gold for the coffers of the Spanish Empire. So just as the Portuguese looked to enslaved Africans to fill their labor needs in the Madeira Islands, the Spanish are going to be looking to the natives to fill their labor needs, at least initially. They are going to be encouraged by Dum Diversas, which said that the enslavement of non-Christian people is going to be okay. And by 1513, they had developed something of a foreign policy toward the natives called the Requirement. The requirement simply states that upon encountering a native population that you don't know, that you've never seen, that they have no prior contact with Europeans, you are to read them a proclamation saying what precisely is in store for you. And so I have that proclamation right here. Of course, they would read it in Spanish, which the natives would have no knowledge of at all. But nevertheless, this was seen as a foreign policy document that justified what was going to happen. So here's what they say. They say, "On behalf of the Spanish kings, subduers of the barbarous nations, we, their servants, notify and make known to you as best we can that the Lord, our God, eternal, living and eternal, created the heaven and the earth, and one man and one woman, of whom you and we, all the men of the world at the time, were and are descendants, and of those who came after and before us. But on account of the multitude which has sprung from this man and woman in the 5,000 years since the world was created, it was necessary that some men should go one way and some another, and that they should be divided into many kingdoms and provinces, for in one alone they could not be sustained." So it's this sort of like history lesson here from a Catholic perspective, right? There's one God and he created everybody, just like you and just like me. But on account of the multitudes, we had to separate. Some people went one way and some people went another. So in other words, now there's Europeans and now there's Americans, and of course there's Asians and there's Africans. But the requirement is letting us know that we are all descendants of the first man and woman. Of course, we're talking about Adam and Eve from the Christian understanding. So the requirement goes on. It says, "Of all these nations, God our Lord gave charge to one man called St. Peter, that he should be Lord and superior of all the men in the world, that all should obey him, and that he should be the head of the whole human race, wherever men should live, under whatever law, sect, or belief they should be, and he gave them the world for his kingdom and jurisdiction. So here we have the requirement establishing the supremacy of the church and the Pope over everybody else. Of all these nations, the Lord our God gave charge to one man, St. Peter. And Catholic theology recognizes St. Peter as the first pope and all of the popes to follow after him as his successors. So this is a way of establishing not only spiritual dominion over the natives, but also temporal dominion. You have to obey him in everything he says. So their highnesses are kings and lords of these islands and land wherever, as best we can, we ask and require that you consider what we have said to you, and that you take the time that shall be necessary to understand and deliberate upon it, and that you acknowledge the church as the ruler and superior of the whole world, and the high priest called the Pope, and in his name the King of Spain, as superiors and lords and kings of these islands. So pretty clear here, right? If we start off with a history lesson, hey, we're all one people. Hey, there's the Pope. Oh, and by the way, the Pope and the church over which he is head is in charge of everything. So this admonishes the natives to submit to the church's authority, both spiritual and temporal. But if you do not do this, says the requirement, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we and can subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highness. We shall take you and your wives and children and shall make slaves of them. And as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highness may command. And we may take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can as vassals who do not obey and refuse to receive their lord. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault, not of that of their highness or ours, nor of these cavaliers who came with us. Wow. So there's the end. There's the heart-stopping end. If you don't obey the Pope, if you don't submit to his spiritual and temporal authority, well, then we're going to make you our slaves. We're going to take your stuff away. Your children are going to be in damage. Oh, and by the way, it's all going to be your fault. So they go and they read this to the natives, and this may sound like really harsh from our perspective, and of course it's harsh from any perspective, but to the Spanish mind, this justified it. This made it okay. They are following the dictates of the Pope, making sure that we're not going to be enslaving anybody any non-Christians, right? We gave everybody a chance to become a Christian, and if they don't want to do it, well, that's their problem, and that means we can enslave them and take their stuff. So on this basis, the Spanish established what was called the encomienda system. Settlers of the in the encomienda system had the legal right, and I'm putting that in air quotes, to both land and Indians for labor. So in other words, sign on with one of these ventures, go across the ocean, and you can become a conquistador. You can become a Spanish soldier settler of the New World, and which will give you what you possibly never could have in Europe, which is land and your own set of slaves, right? So if you're just somebody starting out in the world, this is a really good opportunity for you to make some money. Now, also, we're gonna mention that the encomienda system said that the conquistadors who settle here and get this land have a responsibility to see for the physical and spiritual needs of the Indians under their charge. And so just about every encomienda is going to employ a priest, and a priest is going to do sort of his best to see to the spiritual needs of the Indians. Of course, one of the problems is that if Indians do actually convert to Catholicism, well, that means you can't enslave them anymore. So a lot of the requirement was more or less ignored on those grounds. And what we do see developing out of this encomienda system is slavery. The settlers are just ruthlessly going to exploit the natives. They're going to be very cruel to them, to their physical persons, to their mental persons, to every way you can be cruel to people. It's going to be a very, very cruel system of oppression. They're going to be used in forced mining. in farming, and of course, just about any other jobs that the Spaniards are going to see fit to employ them in. Well, one person, a Spanish priest, his name is Bartolome de las Casas, spoke up about the mistreatment of the natives. He says, the pattern established at the outset has remained to this day, meaning the requirement or nothing has really changed. And the Spaniards still do nothing save tear the native to shreds, murder them, and inflict upon them untold misery, suffering, distress, tormenting, harrying, and persecuting them mercilessly. Should point out that Bartolome de las Casas, he knows what he's talking about. He was originally an encomendero. He was somebody that took a plot of land and was going to settle it. And he moved over to the New World to raise some crops and do what the conquistadors and encomenderos do. And he was so horrified by how he saw the natives being treated that he set all of his slaves free and surrendered all of the property, and then devoted his life to making sure the natives' needs and humanity is going to be recognized. So here are some of the pictures that Bartolome de las Casas put into his book, which was called On the Destruction of the Indies, published in 1542. Well, Las Casas' writings, and certainly the pictures that you just saw in the Destruction of the Indies, 1542, they set off an empire-wide debate about the treatment and the status of the natives. Should we be treating these people as the way they're being treated, or should some other steps be taken to improve their situation? Las Casas is going to be the earliest and certainly the most vocal defender of Indian rights. He famously debates these ideas at a conference in 1550, 1551 with a famous legal scholar named Juan Gines Sepulveda. And the questions are, do Indians have souls? If they do, then does that qualify them as human? What if they do convert to Christianity? Are they full Christians, right? There's a lot of this going on. And this debate is very important because it's the first in Western history of its kind where we actually do start to talk about universal human rights. We've seen very little hints of those throughout world history, and they start to emerge right here with Spain, which is perhaps acting really badly on the world scene, but at the same time, Spain's conscience through Las Casas is being evoked to have to answer these issues. Sepulveda says, those whose condition is such that their function is the use of their bodies, and nothing better can be expected of them. Those, I say, are slaves of nature. It is better for them to be ruled thus. Well, Las Casas responds to that saying, Christ did not give the church power over the pagans to annoy, persecute, afflict, and arouse them to riot and sedition, and to hatred of the Christian religion, which the natives certainly were, but only the power of gentleness, service, kindness, and the words of the gospel to encourage them to put on the gentle yoke of Christ. Well, Las Casas' labors were not in vain. The Spanish Empire did hear his arguments and a lot of the arguments that accumulated around him and passed what was called the New Laws, or the New Laws of the Indies, in 1552. It stated that the natives were free and that the owners of the encomiendas could no longer demand free labor or services from them. So a major step forward in the recognition of universal human rights. They did not. They did need to pay a certain amount of tribute. That is, we can still sort of tax these Indians for their labor, but any extra work was to be paid for. Well, this amounts to the gradual elimination of the encomienda system and the system of slavery as we know it in the New World. But still, these colonies are there for economic purposes. They're there to make money. And so we ask ourselves, where will the cheap labor come from? And if you're starting to admire Las Casas, and I certainly do to an extent, of course, then you're going to have to confront this. Las Casas says, well, here's where the cheap labor is going to come from. How about enslaved Africans, right? So unfortunately, Las Casas is still a man of his time. He is still reflecting a lot of the popular attitudes and racist attitudes of his time. And he says that African slaves are more naturally suited, so he says, for these harsh conditions in the Indies. And so let's just move them in and everything will be better. So unfortunately, that's the direction that slavery begins to head. And so let's shift our focus for just a minute and talk about Africa as Africa begins to enter and intersect with the currents of European exploration. And we need to recognize first that Africa is a diverse continent. It is not a single people nor a single country. There are over 1,000 distinct languages spoken on the African continent with numerous dialects, and we're talking about over 1,000 different and distinct societies. Some of them are in the form of empires, such as Ghana, Yoruba, Mali, Sangay, Benin, or the Great Zimbabwe. And these empires are going to control other peoples. They're going to exact tribute from peoples. They're going to go to war with neighboring groups, and they're going to participate to some extent, or to a lot extent, or to little extent, with the outside world. African religion is, to the north, it's going to intersect largely with the Muslim conquests of earlier centuries. And to the south, or the sub-Saharan regions, we're going to see a lot of we'll just characterize them as traditional religions, or religions that are homegrown to the African continent. Most Africans, we should point out, did not actually live in giant empires. They did live in the interior in smaller family-based units. And few Europeans knew about them, and they knew very few Europeans. And so, just as Europeans are wondering what's in the interior of Africa, a lot of Africans may be wondering what's outside of our little home in, in that regard as well. So, like all human societies, many African societies practiced forms of slavery. But when we talk about slavery, we tend to think of the institution that existed in the United States on the eve of the Civil War, in which slavery was race based and it was never ending, it was lifelong, and it was also hereditary. And that's not really the way African slavery was practiced. African slavery in its various forms in various places often compares well to that of European serfdom. Yes, you're bound to this land. Yes, you have, a limited mobility socially, politically, economically. But nevertheless, there are certain rights that society recognizes and affirms. Also, in African slavery, you would end up in slavery not because of the color of your skin, not because of your family status or something like that. You would end up in slavery often because you owe a debt, and this is a way for you to pay off that debt. Or if your group was captured and defeated in war, then you might end up as a slave for a certain amount of time. But slavery in Africa is often invariably temporary. Very few instances can be found where people were thought to be natural slaves or people were thought to be slaves for life. Sometimes slavery is, in fact, voluntary. In the cases of starvation or ostracism, you really find yourself on the margins of society. You can volunteer for slavery, but again, it's not going to be this lifelong thing. So African slavery is not lifelong. It's not hereditary. You don't pass it on to your children, and it's not race based. But these are things that it's going to become in America as we trace the development of slavery further. So it is also important for us to note that an Arab slave trade existed prior to the Portuguese making inroads into West Africa. So when the Portuguese showed up in the 40s and 50s, they began to participate in an existing network. But by participating in it, they helped transform it. So here's a map that details some of the paths that a lot of enslaved people took. And as you can see, we're looking at the largest destinations being in the West Indies, places like Barbados, which was an English colony that we'll talk about later, or in Brazil, which is a Portuguese colony. So you're going to see a lot of folks that are going to be transported primarily into these agricultural situations in the New World. Relatively few in the overall picture, relatively few are going to end up in the United States, but we are certainly going to see their presence as we move forward in history. Now, the Portuguese like we said, were acting as middlemen in this form of human trafficking. They purchased enslaved people from slave traders in West Africa. And from then, they would sell them to the Dutch or the Spanish or the English or whoever was offering, right? And so most enslaved people, as we saw from the map, ended up in the West Indies or in Brazil. That was for the production of sugarcane, which was extremely labor intensive, extremely dangerous. And that's one of the ways that you start to see slavery transform is it becomes this sort of death sentence, right? People are not expected to survive it once they're sold into these sugarcane plantations in the Americas. And so African slavery grew as the native numbers began to decrease. As you see more and more Native Americans begin to die off, then the need for African or enslaved African labor begins to increase. And so right away, the question should be popping up in your mind. What is happening to all of the natives? Las Casas estimated that by 1550, there were 50,000 enslaved workers, Black African workers enslaved in Hispaniola. So where are all the natives going? Well, the answer is found in a process that historians refer to as the Columbian Exchange. You see, as Europeans traversed the Atlantic, they brought with them plants, animals, and diseases that changed the lives and the landscapes on both sides of the ocean. So this two-way process is called the Columbian Exchange, actually named after Christopher Columbus because all he needed to do to inaugurate this system was to step off the boat and cough. And already there's some microbes floating around that had not been there. So this Columbian exchange smashed together, and I think that's a really good verb because it just violently threw together the ecologies of the land masses that had been separated by at least 17,000 years. So when we talk about the commercial aspects of this, that is the commoditization of things, things that make money, the most important transfer from the old world to the new was sugar. Sugar in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries carried the same economic value as oil does today. And so we can't overstate it. It's a pretty significant cash crop. It is grown in Europe. It's possible to grow in Europe, but it's so much harder to refine because the European climate and soil is just not right for it in all times and all places. So it's very difficult to deal with. But the Americas are perfect. So Columbus first brought it over in 1493, and by 1500 it was all over the Spanish islands, making tons of money for the Spaniards. So European tastes grew with its production. And of course, we have to note that as European taste grew, as more sugar is being cultivated, so did the demand for enslaved labor. Of secondary importance is the tobacco plant. That's an indigenous American plant. Europeans didn't know anything about it before 1492. Native Americans had been using it for medicinal or ritual or even practical purposes for as long as anybody can remember. And when we bring it over to Europe, it was stigmatized as first. It was proof of native savagery. But like all good drugs here that we're going to talk about, it caught on and became a globally sought commodity. Also, chocolate. Chocolate is an important commodity that's going to become really important to Europeans as well. Chocolate is indigenous to Mesoamerica, meaning around Mexico. Cacao beans are a stimulant and they can be used in ritual. And at first, the Europeans called it the devil's vomit, but it caught on just like tobacco did, and it became super popular among Europeans. And tobacco is going to be of particular significance to the North American colonies, the English colonies, because that's going to be the crop that's going to save the colony of Jamestown here. But that is the story that's coming up. Well, another traveler that came between the Americas, Africa, and Europe was the microbe, the deadly, deadly microbe. Things like chickenpox, measles, mumps, and smallpox all made their way from Europe to the Americas. And there was one that did the opposite trip that we know about, and that was syphilis coming from the Americas to the Europeans. So thanks for that. Well, this exchange of microbes set off the worst aspect of the Columbian Exchange, which historians refer to as the Great Dying. Natives fell victim to the diseases, and in time, about 90%, some people argue up to 95% of the native population in Hispaniola and surrounding islands and Mexico and places like that will die from these diseases. Now, interestingly, the reverse is not true. Where you see Native Americans falling victim to chickenpox or measles or smallpox or whatever it is, you just don't see the opposite. Europeans are not affected. So, why was the Great Dying so one sided? So, the guy you're looking at right there is an American scientist by the name of Jared Diamond. And he is an American scientist who published Guns, Germs, and Steels. It's the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and he gives probably the most succinct and best regarded answers as to why the Columbian Exchange was so one sided. His thesis is that the answer is in geography. And here's sort of the outlines of this argument. Okay. He says that Europeans have been exposed to more diseases over time and therefore have a hardier immune system. And that's because the more diseases that a population experiences, the greater the antibodies that build up over time. And antibodies can be passed from mother to child. And so there's sort of a biological memory of when a population encounters a disease such as smallpox or something like that. One of these huge diseases was the Black Death, which happened in the Middle Ages, and that because it wiped out perhaps a third, some even say a half of the European population, that uniquely prepared the European population to withstand future diseases because those who survived people argue, they're endowed with an immunity, and that immunity is what helps them to recognize similar bugs, similar diseases, or related germs and makes them more resistant. There's even some speculation that the descendants of people who survived the Black Death might be immune to the virus HIV, which, as we know, is responsible for the onset of AIDS. Well, he also says that the larger presence of domesticated animals in Europe likewise helped Europeans spread disease, and by spreading disease, they made them better prepared for future disease. So there's more domesticated animals in Europe than there are in the Americas. We'll see that. There's really only one in South America, the llama. And because Europeans live in closer proximity to these animals, they're always being exposed to more and more diseases. And by being exposed to more diseases, you're helping a whole population become hardier and more prepared for it. So, a major part of Jared Diamond's argument is to look at the geographical orientation of both Eurasia and the North and South American continent. So, if we look at Eurasia, we'll see that it's situated on an east west axis. And what that does is it facilitates animal or crop or even pathogen movement because you're going to be experiencing a relatively stable ecology as you go from east to west. See, it gets colder as you travel north south because you're traveling up and down that axis. But east west, you're not going to see that much variation in the sort of things that will grow or the sort of animals that can exist. And you're not going to see a whole lot of variation in the microgens and the pathogens that follow along. So they're not going to be, wiped out by cold or heat or whatever it is. But that's not the same as in the Americas. In the Americas, where the north-south axis is the orientation, it actually prevents these movements. So you're not going to see animals being able to go north or south to great lengths because they can't survive. They're not adapted to it. And in the same way, you're not going to see microbes that follow along on those animals because they're not going to be adapted to it. And so people living in the Americas are going to be exposed to less disease. And over time, their sort of historical biological memory is not going to equip them to withstand this onslaught of European diseases that's going to come with Christopher Columbus. So there's an overall view of the Columbian Exchange. Just take a note of some of the things that you may have thought were indigenous to your part of the world or whatever, and notice that a lot of it comes from Europe and vice versa. So things like cattle or horses or pigs, those all come from Europe and were transplanted to uh, what is today the United States. If you look at some of the Central American crops, things that we probably eat all the time, such as maize, potatoes, maybe you don't do tobacco all the time, but beans, squash, peppers, and cacao or chocolate, all that comes from Mesoamerica and made such a big impact on Europe. Of course, we can trace syphilis from the Americas, and coming from Asia, a big one is going to be sugar and rice. That's right. So there's this huge exchange of stuff that's going on. It really cannot be overstated. The impact of the Columbian exchange, I think we're still seeing its impact today. Well, as we should note that some of the Indian groups were so devastated by the diseases wrought by the Columbian exchange that they conducted what was called mourning wars in European settlements. This is primarily on the East Coast with groups called the Iroquois, which we'll get to a little later, but I still think it's worth noting because it dramatizes just how significant these diseases were. And so in these mourning wars, Indians would go about kidnapping Europeans, healthy Europeans, oftentimes children, and then they would make an attempt to integrate them into European society. The kidnapped would take the name of the deceased and be made to live as the deceased in order to replace the person that has lost. And so these mourning wars became more and more frequent and intense as the death toll rose and would continue even into the 19th century. So we've reached the end. And once again, if you wanted to pause the presentation and have a look at some of the key terms and ideas, and of course, key questions over the content, these are the main ideas and terms over which you are going to be assessed on exams, as well as some of the things that we do in class. So take a note, pause it, write it down, and make sure that you've got these things down, and I will see you in class.